The stars above were streaked with flashes of light as the battle between the human fleet and the Dralcaf forces raged on. Lieutenant Jake Warren's fighter ships dipped through the chaos, narrowly dodging alien missiles. His cockpit rattled with each near miss, but Jake kept his focus. His mission was clear: protect the human fleet at all costs. But things weren't going as planned. The alien Dralcaf ships were relentless, their weapons more advanced than anything Jake had ever seen. Despite the human fleet's best efforts, they were losing ground. Jake's radar beeped urgently. Another enemy ship was on his tail. Come on, come on, Jake muttered to himself, trying to outmaneuver the enemy. His hands gripped the controls, and his heart raced in time with the increasing tension. With a deep breath, he pushed his fighter into a sharp dive, narrowly avoiding a burst of enemy fire. The ship shook violently as a missile from a Dralcaf ship exploded nearby. The force of the blast sent Jake's fighter spinning out of control, and the cockpit lights flickered wildly. He struggled to regain control, but it was no use. The damage was too severe. His engines sputtered, and the ship plunged into the cold void of space, tumbling uncontrollably toward an unknown planet below. Brace for impact, Jake yelled, knowing there was no way to avoid the crash. The ground rushed up to meet him as his fighter slammed into the icy surface of a distant planet, the impact shaking him violently in his seat. The world around him went black. Jake woke up to a sharp pain in his head. Groaning, he blinked and tried to focus. His fighter was a wreck. Half of it was buried in the snow, and the other half lay scattered across the icy landscape. His helmet was cracked, and blood trickled down from a cut on his forehead. He unbuckled himself from the seat, feeling the sharp sting of the cold air as he opened the cockpit. The storm outside was fierce, the wind howling like a wild beast. He needed to move. Now. Jake staggered out of the wreckage, doing his best to ignore the pain in his limbs. The snow was deep, and the temperature was brutal. His breath formed icy clouds in front of him as he tried to assess his surroundings. A dense fog of snow and ice surrounded him, with no sign of any other human survivors. His communications were down, and his emergency beacon wasn't responding. "What in the world?" he muttered, his voice barely audible over the storm. Through the snow, something caught his eye, shapes moving in the distance. Jake squinted, trying to make out what it was. The wind made it hard to see, but he could make out the faint outline of a structure, partially buried in the snow. It looked like some kind of ship. An alien ship. "Great," Jake muttered under his breath. "Just what I need." He was no stranger to alien encounters, but he wasn't sure if he was ready for another fight. The situation was dire, and he didn't have much choice. His only hope was to find shelter and wait for help. He trudged through the deep snow, making his way toward the wreckage of the alien vessel. As he got closer, he could see the outline of the ship more clearly. It looked like it had crashed hard, much like his own ship. The hull was cracked and twisted, but there was still some movement coming from within. He drew his sidearm, prepared for whatever he might find. The door to the ship creaked open with a loud groan. Inside, everything was dark, except for the faint glow of emergency lights. Jake stepped cautiously into the ship, keeping his weapon at the ready. And that's when he saw her. A figure, hunched and bleeding, lay on the floor of the wrecked vessel. She looked like a warrior, tall and strong, her alien features twisted in pain. Her skin was a pale, silvery blue, and her long hair, dark as midnight, was matted with blood. Her eyes were closed, and she didn't seem to notice Jake's presence. She was unconscious, but alive. Jake's first instinct was to help. Despite the chaos of the battle and the cold, he knew he couldn't leave her there to die. He stepped forward, but before he could reach her, she stirred. Her eyes opened, and they locked onto him with fierce intensity. "Human," she growled, her voice low and threatening. "Why are you here?" Jake's heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary alien. She was a Dralcath warrior. a species known for their strength and deadly combat skills. And now, she was awake, injured, and staring at him like she was ready to rip him apart. "I'm not here to fight," Jake said calmly, keeping his hands visible. "I'm just trying to survive." The alien warrior glared at him, her breathing shallow but steady. She didn't trust him, and he could hardly blame her. They were enemies, after all. But in the harsh cold of the frozen world, survival was all that mattered. And right now, Jake couldn't afford to let her die. "Stay back," the warrior commanded, her voice full of authority. "If you want to survive, you will do as I say." The alien warrior's eyes burned with mistrust as she slowly pushed herself up, her movements stiff from the pain. Jake stood still, his hands raised slightly, showing that he meant no harm. The storm howled outside, and the temperature was plummeting rapidly. If they didn't work together, neither of them would survive the freezing night. "You're a human," she growled, her voice rough and strained. "Why should I trust you?" Jake swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. The situation was tense, and every word mattered. "I'm not here to fight you," he said cautiously. "I just want to survive. If you want to live, we have to work together." The warrior's glare didn't soften. "Survive? You are weak. Your species cannot survive on this frozen planet alone." Jake clenched his fists, but he didn't argue. She was right in some ways. The planet was harsh and unforgiving. He wasn't sure how long he could last without shelter and warmth. But the way she spoke, like she could dismiss him with a flick of her wrist, made him feel small. Still, he knew they needed each other to make it through the night. The sound of the wind outside intensified, a cold blast of air flooding the ship as the door creaked open. They both turned, and Jake saw that the ship's energy was failing. The lights flickered and then went dark, leaving them in near-total darkness. "We need to fix the ship," Jake said quickly, his voice steady despite the fear growing in him. "We can't stay here with the storm getting worse. We need warmth, and that ship is our only hope." The warrior eyed him suspiciously. "I do not trust you," she repeated, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes. She knew she couldn't survive out there alone, not in that storm. Without another word, she limped over to the control panel. Jake followed, trying to ignore the way her eyes darted back and forth between him and the ship's damaged systems. It was clear she wasn't used to working with others, especially not humans. Jake took a deep breath. "Look, I'm not asking you to trust me, but we need to repair the heating system if we want to live through the night. You know how to fight, and I know how to fix things. Together, we might have a chance." The warrior was silent for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she considered his words. Then, with a grunt, she turned back to the damaged systems and began to work, her hands moving quickly despite the pain in her body. Jake took a step back, watching her in awe. There was strength in her, a quiet power that made him realize just how dangerous she could be. Jake started working on the backup generator, pulling tools from his emergency kit. As he worked, he could feel her gaze on him, like a sharp blade ready to strike at any moment. But he ignored it. The ship's power was low, and every second counted. "What's your name?" Jake asked, his voice breaking the silence. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes flicked to him once more, her features hard. "Ziva," she said at last, her tone cool. "And you are a human. You should not be here." Jake nodded, respecting her directness. "Jake," he replied simply. "And I'm not going anywhere. Not until we're off this planet." The silence that followed was heavy. Both of them focused on their tasks, the only sounds in the room the hum of their work and the whistling wind outside. After a few more minutes of tense silence, Jake's eyes flicked up to Ziva. He couldn't help but notice the way she moved. Each motion was deliberate and controlled, as if she had been trained her whole life to survive in hostile environments. "You're not like the others," Jake said cautiously, unsure if he was crossing a line. "You're different. I've fought Dralcaf before. They don't show mercy. Ziva paused, her hand stilling over the damaged panel. For a brief moment, Jake wondered if he had said something wrong, but then she spoke, her voice low but steady. I am no different from them, she said. I do what is necessary. I fight because it is all I know. The Dralcath do not show mercy, but survival. Survival is different. Her words sent a chill through Jake, even though the ship was freezing. He had seen Dralcath warriors in battle before, brutal, relentless, and unforgiving. But Ziva wasn't like the others. There was a hint of something softer beneath her exterior, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He nodded, not sure how to respond, but he didn't need to say anything. They both understood what had to be done. After a few more minutes of silence, Jake finished the repairs to the generator. He flipped a switch, and the ship's power hummed back to life. The lights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the control room. Warmth slowly began to seep into the ship, a welcome relief from the bone-chilling cold outside. Ziva didn't say anything, but Jake saw her relax, just slightly. For the first time, he thought he might have earned a shred of her trust. It wasn't much, but it was something. Now we survive, Ziva said, her voice firm. Jake nodded, feeling a sense of determination grow within him. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The ship was running on limited power now, but at least it was warm. The emergency lights cast a faint glow, and the heating system hummed steadily, providing much-needed relief from the bitter cold outside. Jake leaned back against the wall, trying to catch his breath after the repairs. His mind raced. He knew they couldn't stay here forever. The ship's condition was too unstable. They needed proper shelter, and fast. Ziva had sat down on the floor, her back against the console, her eyes closed. She had a strong, determined look on her face, but Jake could see the exhaustion in her features. She had pushed herself too hard. The crash had been hard on both of them, and neither of them could afford to ignore their injuries. The alien warrior's wounds were more severe than she had let on, and Jake couldn't ignore the sharp, labored breaths she was taking. We can't stay here, Jake said, breaking the silence. This ship is barely holding together. We need to find a place to take shelter, somewhere we can stay for a while. Ziva opened her eyes and looked at him, her gaze unreadable. And where do you suggest we go? She asked, her voice cold, though Jake could hear the faint hint of uncertainty. I saw a cave not far from here when I crashed, Jake replied, pointing toward the thick fog outside. It might be a long shot, but it's the only option we have. Ziva's eyes narrowed, and she stood up slowly, ignoring the wince of pain that crossed her face. I do not trust your eyes, she said, her tone still sharp. But if it's our only choice, we go. But if you lead me into a trap, human, I will make you regret it. Jake didn't respond to the threat, though he couldn't help but feel the weight of her words. There was no love lost between them. He knew she didn't trust him, and he didn't trust her fully either. But survival had a way of pushing personal feelings aside. They needed each other if they wanted to survive this icy wasteland. The storm outside howled even louder, a cold wind rattling the ship's hull. Jake glanced out the cracked window, seeing nothing but swirling snow and darkness. If they didn't leave soon, the storm would trap them here. Let's go, Jake said, getting to his feet and grabbing his pack. We don't have much time. Ziva followed him without another word, her movements still stiff but determined. They made their way to the exit, stepping out into the storm. The wind hit them immediately, almost knocking them off their feet. Jake pulled his coat tighter around himself, but it did little to keep out the biting cold. Ziva, on the other hand, didn't seem to be affected at all. Her alien body was built for harsh environments, and it showed in her confident, unfazed stride. The cave Jake had seen from the wreckage wasn't far, but in the storm, it felt like an eternity. The snow whipped around them, blinding them at times, and the ground beneath their feet was uneven and treacherous. Every step felt like it could be their last, but Jake pushed forward, refusing to stop. After what felt like hours of trudging through the snow, they finally saw it. A dark, jagged opening in the side of a rocky hill. The cave. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and that was all they needed. Jake stumbled toward it, his body exhausted and aching from the cold and the long walk. Once inside, they were met with some relief. The storm's howling winds were blocked by the rocks, and the temperature inside was several degrees warmer than it had been outside. Jake collapsed against the wall, letting out a long breath. They had made it. Ziva took a few steps into the cave, scanning the area with sharp eyes. "This will do," she said, her voice still tense. "But don't think for a second I trust you." Jake didn't reply. He was too tired to argue. All he cared about now was survival. They had to rest, regroup, and figure out their next move. He unrolled his emergency blanket and lay down, staring at the cave ceiling. Ziva remained standing, her back against the cold rock, keeping watch. The silence between them stretched on, but it was a comfortable silence, a temporary truce in a world where everything else seemed to be against them. Jake closed his eyes, allowing himself to finally rest. He was exhausted, but sleep wouldn't come easily. His mind was still racing with thoughts of what had happened, what might happen next. They were still trapped on an unknown planet, surrounded by danger, and the only ally he had was an injured alien warrior who could barely stand him. But for now, it was enough. He didn't know how long they would last, but he knew one thing for sure. They had to keep moving, keep fighting, and keep surviving, for as long as it took. The cave was quiet except for the occasional sound of wind echoing outside. Jake had managed to sleep for a few hours, but the cold never let up. It was still freezing, and the cave wasn't much warmer than the outside. He could hear Ziva moving around, though she hadn't said anything since they entered the shelter. She was standing near the entrance, her sharp eyes scanning the storm outside, clearly on high alert. Jake sat up slowly, his body aching from the cold and the previous day's physical exertion. He grabbed his coat and pulled it tighter around his chest, trying to keep in whatever heat he had left. The wind outside howled like an angry beast, but inside they had a little bit of peace. For now, at least. "We should keep moving," Jake said, breaking the silence. "The storm isn't letting up. It could last for days." Ziva didn't look at him, but her voice cut through the air like a blade. "And where do you suggest we go? There is nowhere to run on this planet. You think the storm will stop if you walk far enough." Jake sighed. She was right, but that didn't change the fact that they couldn't stay in the cave for long. They needed supplies, more shelter, and maybe even help. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we can't stay here. We need to find something more secure." For a moment, the two of them were silent again, each lost in their own thoughts. But suddenly, Ziva's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing as she looked toward the cave entrance. Jake immediately tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon at his side. "What is it?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I hear something," Ziva replied quietly, her posture tense. "Footsteps. Outside." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He strained his ears, but all he could hear was the wind. Ziva, however, seemed to be able to pick up on sounds he couldn't. "Stay low," she ordered, crouching down and moving toward the shadows of the cave. Jake followed her, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He could feel the adrenaline starting to surge through him. They both waited in silence, every muscle in Jake's body tense, ready to react. Minutes passed, but nothing happened. The footsteps stopped. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat, but Ziva didn't seem to relax. She was still listening intently, her alien senses far sharper than his. Then, without warning, the cave entrance exploded with noise. A heavy crash sounded from outside, and Jake's heart raced as he reached for his weapon again. The storm was loud, but there was no mistaking the deep growl that came from the darkness. "It's not just the storm," Ziva whispered. "There are creatures out there." Jake's stomach dropped. He had heard rumors of dangerous creatures on planets like this, beasts that thrived in the cold and could survive the harshest conditions. He hadn't wanted to believe it, but now it seemed that they were about to find out firsthand. The growl came again, closer this time. Then a massive figure appeared at the entrance, its outline barely visible through the thick snowfall. Jake's eyes widened as the creature stepped closer into the cave's dim light. It was huge, its body covered in thick, matted fur, and its eyes glowed an eerie green in the dark. It was something out of a nightmare, a predator built to hunt and survive in this frozen wasteland. Ziva didn't hesitate. She was already on her feet, moving toward the creature with quick, fluid steps. Jake barely had time to react before she lunged forward, her alien strength sending her flying at the creature with terrifying speed. The beast roared in anger and swiped at Ziva with massive claws. She ducked and rolled, narrowly avoiding the strike. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the fight unfold. Ziva was powerful, but the creature was relentless. Every time she struck, the beast recovered quickly, its thick fur absorbing most of the blows. Jake didn't know what to do. He was no fighter, and the only weapon he had was a small plasma gun that would barely faze a creature like this. He could hear Ziva grunting with effort as she continued to dodge and strike, but the creature wasn't backing down. It was too strong, too determined. "Ziva," Jake shouted, his voice hoarse. "What do we do?" She didn't answer him, but her eyes flicked toward him for a split second. That was all it took. Jake didn't think, he just acted. He grabbed his plasma gun and aimed it at the beast, his hands shaking. He fired a shot, and the plasma beam hit the creature square in the chest. The creature howled in pain and staggered back, momentarily stunned. Ziva took advantage of the opening, launching herself at the creature and delivering a powerful blow to its throat. The beast staggered, weakened by the combined assault. It roared in fury one last time before collapsing to the ground, lifeless. Ziva stood over the fallen creature, her chest heaving with exertion. Her face was grim, but there was no mistaking the relief in her eyes. Jake's breath was ragged as he slowly lowered his weapon. "I didn't think we were going to make it." Ziva didn't respond immediately, but after a moment she nodded. "We made it, for now." Jake let out a shaky laugh, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. "We need to keep moving." That thing was just the beginning. Ziva's expression hardened. "Then we will fight, until we reach safety." They both knew the journey wasn't over, but for now, they had survived another challenge. Together. The battle with the creature had drained them both, but there was no time to rest. The storm outside hadn't slowed down, and the danger still loomed. The cave, though a temporary refuge, would not be enough to keep them safe for long. Jake and Ziva knew they had to keep moving. "We can't stay here," Jake said, his voice hoarse from the fight and exhaustion. "We need to find somewhere more secure." Ziva didn't respond at first. She was standing by the cave entrance, her eyes scanning the snowstorm. She didn't seem affected by the cold at all, her alien physiology giving her a strength Jake could only admire. But he could see the fatigue in her posture, the strain in her muscles. She was tired, tired of the storm, tired of fighting, tired of everything. "Where do we go?" Ziva finally asked, her voice sharp, but there was a hint of something else. Maybe uncertainty. Jake had been thinking about that question ever since the attack. The planet was harsh, unforgiving. The storm showed no sign of stopping. There had to be something, anything, that could offer more protection. He remembered a mountain range he had seen from the wreckage, tall peaks that might offer shelter or at least some cover from the storm. "There's a mountain range not far from here," Jake said, pointing toward the east. "I saw it when I was trying to fix the ship. Maybe we can find shelter there. It's our best bet." Ziva looked at him, her alien eyes narrowed. "And you think we can make it through that?" she asked, the tone of her voice making it clear she wasn't sure. Jake nodded, though he wasn't so sure himself. "We don't have much of a choice. We move now, or we freeze in this cave." For a long moment, Ziva didn't speak. She just stood there, staring out into the storm. Jake wasn't sure if she was considering his suggestion, or if she was simply waiting for something to change. But then, she turned to face him. "Fine," she said, her voice firm. "We go. But if you lead me into another trap, human, I will not be forgiving." Jake gave her a quick nod. He understood her warning. They were both running out of options, and trust was hard to come by. But survival came first. That was something they both understood. The storm outside was fierce, the wind howling like a wild beast, but they had no other choice. They gathered their things, making sure to take what little they could carry. Jake grabbed his plasma gun and checked its energy. It was running low, but it was still functional. Ziva, of course, had her weapons. Her strength alone could do a lot of damage. But in a storm like this, they couldn't take chances. Together, they stepped out into the snowstorm. The wind hit them immediately, as if the planet itself was fighting against them. The snow swirled around, thick and blinding, making it hard to see even a few feet ahead. Jake could barely make out the figure of Ziva ahead of him, her silhouette barely visible through the dense snow. They moved quickly, trying to keep close to each other to avoid getting separated in the blizzard. Every step was a challenge. The snow up to their knees, the cold biting through their clothing. It felt as if the storm was determined to wear them down, to break them both. But they pressed on. After hours of struggling through the storm, Jake's legs were numb, his body aching. The mountain range was still far ahead, the peaks barely visible through the swirling snow. He couldn't see how much farther they had to go, but he knew they had no other choice. They had to keep going. Ziva wasn't much better off. She moved with her usual grace, but even she was slowed by the relentless storm. Her breath came in short bursts, and Jake could see the tension in her shoulders. She wasn't as immune to the cold as she let on. She was pushing herself, just like him, but neither of them could afford to stop. "We're close," Jake said, trying to give them both some hope. "I can see the mountains. We're almost there." Ziva didn't respond, but he saw her eyes flick to the direction he had pointed. The mountains were barely visible, a faint outline against the storm's fury. She nodded, a silent agreement to keep going. But then, without warning, the ground beneath them shifted. Jake's heart skipped a beat. The snow around him shifted, and suddenly he was falling. He barely had time to react before he tumbled down a steep incline, sliding through the thick snow. His breath caught in his throat as he struggled to grab onto something, anything, to stop his fall. Ziva, her alien reflexes quicker than Jake's, reached out and grabbed his arm just in time. She stopped his fall with surprising strength, her grip firm. "Hold on," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I've got you." Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he grabbed her hand, trying to steady himself. But the ground was unstable, and the snow was deep. He could feel himself slipping again, but Ziva's grip was unyielding. With a final pull, Ziva managed to drag him back up to solid ground. Jake collapsed against her, gasping for breath. He was shaken, but alive. They were both alive. "That was too close," Jake said, his voice shaky. Ziva didn't respond, but he saw her glance around. The storm was still raging, but the mountain range was now within reach. They were so close. But the question was, would they make it before the storm consumed them completely? The wind howled around them, but Jake and Ziva pushed forward. They were near the base of the mountain range now, the towering peaks just ahead. The snow had thickened, making it nearly impossible to see anything beyond a few feet. Every step felt like a battle against nature itself. Jake's legs burned, his body aching from exhaustion, but there was no choice. He had to keep going. Ziva, too, was struggling. Her usually confident stride had slowed, and her breath was heavier now. Even though she seemed immune to the cold, Jake knew that the storm was taking its toll on her as well. They couldn't afford to stop. Not now. The mountain range loomed above them like a fortress, offering a faint sense of hope. If they could just reach it, there might be shelter or at least some form of protection from the storm. They had been walking for hours, with no sign of the storm letting up. Every minute felt like an eternity. "There's a cave up ahead," Ziva shouted over the wind, her sharp eyes catching the faint outline of an opening in the mountainside. "We can make it." Jake barely heard her over the roar of the storm, but when he saw the direction she was pointing, his heart lifted. A cave. It wasn't much, but it was a place to rest, a place where they could catch their breath and regroup. They stumbled toward the cave, their movements clumsy and slow as the snow piled higher around them. The entrance was small, barely visible in the storm, but it was enough. They scrambled toward it, Ziva reaching it first and pulling Jake in after her. The moment they were inside, the wind's howl was replaced by silence. The cold was still there, but it was less harsh, sheltered by the stone walls of the cave. Jake dropped to the ground, his body trembling from the effort, his breath coming in heavy gasps. Ziva, too, looked exhausted as she crouched by the entrance, her eyes scanning the darkness inside the cave. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. They were both too worn out from the harsh journey to do anything but rest. "We made it," Jake said finally, his voice hoarse. His eyes met Ziva's, and for the first time in a long while, he saw something like relief in her expression. Ziva nodded, but she didn't sit down. Her posture remained tense, alert. "We're not safe yet," she said, her voice serious. "The storm could force us out of here, or worse, there could be predators nearby." Jake nodded in agreement, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The cave seemed safe for now, but Ziva was right. Nothing was certain. He reached into his pack and pulled out the last of their food supplies, offering it to Ziva. She took it without a word, but Jake could tell that she appreciated the gesture. "How far do you think we are from the top of the mountain?" Jake asked, taking a bite of his own food. Ziva didn't answer right away. She sat down across from him, her eyes lost in thought. "I don't know," she said at last. "It could take us days to reach the summit, but we don't have that much time. We need to keep moving." Jake's stomach twisted with anxiety. He knew she was right. The storm wasn't going to stop, and they couldn't stay here for long. But the mountain was their only hope. If they could reach the top, there might be a way to contact help, or at least find more shelter. But it wasn't just the storm they had to worry about. The planet was full of dangers, and they had no idea what might be waiting for them on the other side of the mountains. They sat in silence for a while, both of them thinking about what came next. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cave, they were safe, at least for now. "I never thought I'd end up on a planet like this," Jake said quietly, breaking the silence. He looked at Ziva, his eyes searching hers. "I never thought I'd be in this situation at all." Ziva met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I didn't think I would either," she said after a long pause. "But here we are." Jake nodded. There was a certain weight to her words, a truth that neither of them could deny. They were here, stuck on a strange, hostile world, with no way of knowing how long they would survive. But there was one thing Jake was sure of. They weren't alone anymore. They were in this together, and they would fight to survive together. Ziva stood up abruptly, her eyes scanning the cave once more. "We need to keep moving," she said again, her tone as firm as ever. "We can't waste time." Jake pushed himself to his feet as well, his body stiff and sore. "I agree. Let's get to the top." They gathered their things quickly, preparing for the next leg of their journey. The cave had been a temporary refuge, but it was time to face the storm again. They had no choice. The mountain was waiting, and it was their only hope for survival. The storm showed no signs of letting up. The wind howled through the narrow pass, its icy fingers reaching up to bite them. And the snow swirled in thick white clouds, making it impossible to see anything beyond a few feet. Jake and Ziva trudged onward, their legs aching with every step, but neither of them spoke. Words felt unnecessary now. They knew what had to be done. The mountain loomed above them, still a distant silhouette in the heavy snow. It felt as if they had been climbing for days. The cold was brutal, but the thought of finding shelter or even a glimpse of safety at the summit pushed them forward. There was no turning back now. Ziva had taken the lead, as she always did. Her sharp eyes scanned the terrain, alert to any sign of danger. Jake followed closely behind her, his breath visible in the frigid air. Every few minutes, Ziva would glance back to make sure Jake was still keeping up. Despite her strength and resilience, he knew she was also feeling the strain of their journey. "Do you think we'll make it?" Jake asked, his voice muffled by the howling wind. Ziva didn't respond right away. She paused, scanning the area ahead before finally turning back to face him. Her eyes were steady, though there was a faint hint of uncertainty. "We have no choice but to keep going," she said, her voice resolute. "We'll make it. We have to." Jake nodded, though a part of him wasn't entirely sure. The storm had been relentless, and the mountains seemed so far away. But Ziva's determination was contagious, and he couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. Minutes turned to hours, and the climb grew steeper. The snow was deeper here, and the wind seemed to cut through their clothing with even more force. Jake's muscles screamed for rest, but he refused to stop. The thought of giving up wasn't an option, not after everything they had been through. They were in this together. At last, Ziva stopped in her tracks, her head cocked slightly as she listened for something. Jake didn't know what she was hearing, but he trusted her instincts. She had led them this far, and he knew she wouldn't stop now. "There's something ahead," she said, her voice tense. "It's faint, but I can feel it. Shelter. We're close." Jake's heart raced at the news. He pushed his body to move faster, his legs aching, his breath shallow, but his mind focused on the idea of shelter. After everything they'd endured, the thought of rest, even just for a moment, felt like a dream. They pressed forward, and as they rounded the next bend, something ahead finally caught Jake's eye. It was faint at first, a dark shape in the distance, but it became clearer with every step. It was a small building, half buried in snow, but still standing strong. "A cabin," Ziva murmured, her voice filled with relief. "We made it." The two of them stumbled toward the cabin, their movements shaky from exhaustion, but filled with purpose. When they reached the door, Ziva pulled it open with surprising ease, revealing a simple but warm interior. There were no signs of life, but the shelter was intact. Jake stepped inside, letting the warmth of the space wrap around him like a comforting embrace. For the first time in what felt like forever, he let out a long breath, allowing his body to relax. Ziva followed him in, closing the door behind them and leaning against it for support. She didn't speak for a moment, simply taking in the safe haven they had found. "We did it," Jake said, his voice hoarse but full of gratitude. "We're safe." Ziva gave him a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "For now," she said, her gaze shifting toward the small stove in the corner. She moved toward it quickly, starting a fire to bring warmth to the room. "But we still have a lot ahead of us. This is just the beginning." Jake knew she was right. The storm had been a test of endurance, but it wasn't over yet. They still had to find a way off this planet, a way to survive. But for now, they had made it. They had found shelter when all seemed lost. "Thank you," Jake said, turning to Ziva as she worked the stove, "for not giving up." Ziva glanced back at him, her expression softening for the first time in hours. "We don't give up," she said simply. "Not now. Not ever." As the fire crackled to life and warmth spread through the cabin, Jake knew they had a long road ahead. But for the first time since the storm began, he felt a glimmer of hope. They had survived the worst of it. They were still standing, and together, they could face whatever came next.